It is the early hours of 24th July, 1943, and somewhere above the North Sea, a short Sterling of RAF Bomber Command is climbing towards 10,000 feet, engines droning in that low, relentless rhythm that every crew learns to live inside for hours at a time. Below the flight deck, a young air gunner reaches into a cardboard box and pulls out a bundle of what looks, absurdly, like party decorations. Strips of black paper, backed with aluminium foil, each one about 30 centimeters long and a couple of centimeters wide. On a signal from the navigator, he begins posting them out through a small chute, one bundle every minute, then faster. Thousands of them tumbling away into the darkness, catching what little moonlight there is, and drifting down over Germany like some strange, silent snowfall. Nothing about this looks like war. It looks like a mistake. It looks like somebody has loaded the wrong cargo. And yet within minutes, 70 kilometers away, in a concrete bunker outside Hamburg, German radar operators are staring at screens that have suddenly, inexplicably, filled with static. Where there should be a handful of clear, trackable blips representing incoming bombers, there is now an impenetrable blizzard of false returns. Searchlights that should be locking onto aircraft begin sweeping uselessly across empty sky. Night fighters that should be vectored precisely onto their targets are instead sent chasing ghosts. That night, over 600 RAF bombers strike Hamburg in the opening raid of Operation Gomorrah, and the German air defense system, one of the most sophisticated in the world, is rendered almost completely blind. The strips of foil are known in the flat, deliberately unglamorous language the British loved for their secret weapons, simply as window. It cost almost nothing to produce. It required no complex machinery, no rare materials, no years of research into exotic physics. And for more than a year before that night over Hamburg, the people who invented it were forbidden from using it at all, for fear that the moment Britain revealed the trick, Germany would simply turn it back around and use it against London. This is the story of how a scrap of foil, a piece of scientific carelessness, and a battle of nerve inside Whitehall combined to save the lives of thousands of aircrew, and how the very people who discovered it, very nearly, weren't allowed to use it when it mattered most. By the summer of 1943, RAF Bomber Command was losing the war of attrition it could least afford to lose. Bomber crews were dying at a rate that, on paper, made survival almost a mathematical impossibility. A crew's operational tour was set at 30 missions, and by the middle of the war, the statistical chance of an individual crew completing that tour without being killed, captured, or wounded stood at somewhere close to 1 in 4. Losses across Bomber Command as a whole regularly ran above 5% per raid, a figure that sounds modest until it is multiplied across dozens of missions and tens of thousands of young men. Over the course of the war, more than 55,000 Bomber Command aircrew would be killed, a casualty rate higher, proportionally, than that suffered by junior infantry officers in the trenches of the First World War. Every existing countermeasure had been tried and had fallen short. Bombers flew at night specifically to reduce the risk of interception. Yet German night fighter crews were finding them anyway, with unnerving consistency, on routes that should have offered the cover of total darkness. Aircraft were fitted with additional defensive machine guns, extra armor around fuel tanks, and elaborate evasive corkscrew maneuvers taught to every pilot as standard procedure. And none of it addressed the underlying problem. which was that the enemy usually knew exactly where a bomber was before its crew ever caught sight of a fighter closing in. Attempts at jamming individual radar frequencies with dedicated equipment showed some promise, but required constant adjustment as German engineers shifted frequencies in response, an exhausting game of electronic cat and mouse that favored whichever side could react fastest. Nothing available in 1942 offered a solution that could be produced quickly, deployed by ordinary aircrew with minimal training, and updated cheaply if the enemy adapted. The problem, in short, looked very much like it might not have a solution at all, at least not one that Britain's existing scientific and industrial approach seemed capable of producing in time to matter. The reason for this slaughter had a name, and that name was Kammhuber. General Josef Kammhuber had spent the early years of the war constructing an air defense system of extraordinary sophistication, a network the British came to call the Kammhuber line. Though it was never a single line at all, but a lattice of overlapping radar boxes, stretching from Denmark down through the Low Countries. Each box relied on a pairing of radar systems, long-range Freya sets to give early warning of approaching bomber streams, and shorter-range, more precise Würzburg sets to guide individual night fighters onto individual bombers with lethal accuracy. A ground controller would watch one Würzburg screen tracking the bomber and a second tracking the fighter, talking the fighter pilot in over radio until his own onboard equipment or simply his eyes could finish the job. It worked with horrifying efficiency. Each defended box could typically only handle one interception at a time, which was a limitation. But the boxes were so densely packed along the bomber's route that a single raid might run the gauntlet of a dozen or more before ever reaching its target, and then had to run the same gauntlet home again. British scientists and airmen alike understood by 1942 that no amount of additional armor plating or evasive maneuvering was going to solve a problem that was fundamentally electronic in nature. You could not outfly a radar beam. The Germans could see the bombers coming with an accuracy measured in tens of meters, long before anti-aircraft guns or fighters ever came within visual range. Something had to break that chain of detection itself, not the men flying through it. The answer to that problem had, in fact, already been sitting in a filing cabinet for the better part of a year, and it had arrived almost by accident. In the summer of 1942, scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, then based at Malvern, were investigating exactly how radar echoes worked when they noticed something curious. Metal foil strips cut to roughly half the wavelength of a given radar signal produced enormous false echoes when tumbled through the air, echoes strong enough to swamp a screen entirely. It was Joan Curran, a young physicist working within the TRE's team, who is credited with much of the crucial early experimentation, testing different lengths and materials until she arrived at a configuration that worked devastatingly well against the German Würzburg sets, which operated on a wavelength of around 53 centimeters. Cut aluminium foil strips to roughly 26 centimeters, the physics dictated, and you could create a radar echo indistinguishable on a screen from an actual aircraft. The manufacturing process, once the principle was proven, was almost comically simple by the standards of wartime weapons development. Ordinary paper backing was coated with a thin layer of aluminium, cut into strips and packaged into bundles that a gunner could physically post out through a flare chute or a dedicated aperture cut into the aircraft's fuselage. There was no factory in the Ruhr to bomb, no rare alloy to source, no precision engineering tolerance to maintain. Production could be handled by ordinary printing and packaging firms across Britain, and by the time it finally saw use, output ran to many millions of individual strips, though exact wartime production figures remain patchy in the surviving records scattered across contracts that were, for obvious reasons, not treated as a priority for careful archiving. Each bundle, dropped from height, would blossom outward as it fell, drifting down over several minutes, each strip fluttering and turning in a way that mimicked, on a radar screen, the radar cross-section of a heavy bomber. A single Lancaster crew, dropping bundles at the recommended rate, could paint the sky above a target with what looked, electronically, like an entire additional squadron. To understand why this worked so completely, it helps to think of radar not as a camera, but as an echo chamber. A radar set sends out a pulse and listens for what bounces back, and it has no innate way of distinguishing between an echo bounced off 18 tons of aluminium and steel, and an echo bounced off a scrap of foil roughly the size of a bookmark, provided that foil is cut to the right length for the wavelength involved. It is roughly equivalent to shouting into a canyon and being unable to tell whether the echo you hear back came from a person or from a piece of sheet metal vibrating in the wind at just the right frequency. The German operators had, in effect, spent years building an extraordinarily sensitive listening system without ever anticipating that someone might learn to fake the sound of what they were listening for on an industrial scale, using material that cost pennies. And this is where the story turns from technical triumph to genuine, nail-biting, bureaucratic drama. Churchill's scientific advisors, chiefly the physicist R.V. Jones, understood almost immediately what window represented, but they also understood, with equal clarity, that the principle would work just as well in reverse. If British bombers could blind German radar with foil, German bombers could just as easily blind British radar over London and other cities, at a moment when the Blitz, while diminished, was by no means a distant memory, and fears of renewed heavy raids remained real. For more than a year, through the back half of 1942 and into 1943, Windows sat ready and tested, its use forbidden by direct order, essentially a loaded weapon that nobody dared fire for fear of the recoil. Bomber crews continued to die in significant numbers against the Kammhuber Line defenses throughout this period, a fact that later prompted uncomfortable, largely unresolved debate about whether earlier deployment might have saved additional lives, weighed against the risk of German retaliation in kind. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more to this story still to come. The decision to finally release Window came in the run-up to Operation Gomorrah in July 1943, the sustained Allied bombing campaign against Hamburg. Once analysis suggested that Allied air defenses had matured enough and bomber losses had grown severe enough that the calculation had shifted decisively in Britain's favor. The results that first night over Hamburg exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Bomber Command's losses on the opening raid fell to a fraction of what had been expected against a target of Hamburg's defensive strength, with figures for that raid running dramatically below the loss rates the same target would ordinarily have extracted. German night fighter controllers, listening in over radio, could be heard by British intelligence intercepts, expressing open confusion and frustration, unable to distinguish real threats from phantom ones, while anti-aircraft batteries fired blind barrages into empty sky. Some German accounts describe operators initially assuming a technical fault in their own equipment, spending precious minutes trying to recalibrate sets that were, in fact, working exactly as designed against an enemy they had no way of filtering out. The psychological effect on German defenses arguably outlasted the immediate technical one. Confidence in the entire Kammhuber line system, a network that had taken years and enormous resources to build, was badly shaken almost overnight, and German engineers were forced into a scramble to develop countermeasures, some of which, ironically, involved abandoning strict reliance on radar altogether in favor of freelance night fighter tactics, guided partly by eyesight and running commentary from ground observers. A shift that itself created new vulnerabilities the RAF would go on to exploit. Records of individual squadron experiences from this period vary considerably in detail, some crews recording almost eerily quiet passages through what should have been heavily defended airspace, others still encountering determined resistance from fighters operating outside the radar net. A reminder that window was a powerful tool rather than a magic invisibility cloak, and that its effectiveness depended heavily on how thoroughly it was deployed on any given night. Germany's own answer to this kind of countermeasure developed under the name Düppel, after the village where early German experiments with similar foil strips had reportedly taken place years earlier, reveals one of the stranger footnotes to this story. German scientists had, in fact, discovered much the same principle independently and considerably earlier than the British effort. Yet their own high command had imposed an almost identical prohibition, terrified that Britain would learn the trick and use it against German cities. Both nations, in other words, sat on the same discovery simultaneously, each side too frightened of the other's retaliation to use a weapon that might have shortened their own casualty lists considerably. The Americans, once briefed by the British, adopted the practice rapidly for the United States Army Air Force's own bomber operations, referring to the same tinfoil strips as chaff, a term that would eventually become the standard international word for the technique and remains in use in modern radar reflective forms to this day. Comparatively, American production scaled the concept up considerably given the sheer industrial capacity available, but the underlying British physics, worked out at Malvern with card, scissors, and careful measurement, remained essentially unchanged, refined rather than reinvented. The material legacy of window is, by its very nature, almost invisible. Nobody collects wartime foil strips in museums the way they preserve aircraft or weapons, because the strips were designed to be thrown away by the million and scattered indiscriminately across the fields and rooftops of occupied Europe and Germany itself. An afterlife that occasionally surprises historians, when caches of the material turn up in old attics or building renovations decades later. What survives instead is the data, comparative loss rates before and after its introduction, intelligence assessments of German confusion, and the enduring shape of an idea. Every modern military aircraft that carries chaff dispensers today, every naval vessel equipped with similar decoy systems against radar-guided missiles, is drawing on a principle first proven with paper, glue, and aluminium foil at a research station in the English countryside. The RAF's own accounts, along with archives held by the Imperial War Museum, continue to hold surviving technical reports and a small number of preserved sample bundles from the period, offering a physical, if modest, link back to that summer of 1943. What makes this story worth telling in the end is not the ingenuity of the physics, elegant as it was, but the strange and very human hesitation that surrounded it. Here was a solution capable of saving thousands of lives, sitting finished and tested, deliberately left unused for over a year, because the people who held it understood with total clarity that unleashing it meant admitting the enemy could do the same thing back. That is not the story of a triumphant breakthrough marching confidently into action. It is the story of frightened, careful men holding a weapon that terrified them almost as much as the problem it solved, waiting until the balance of risk finally tipped, and only then letting it fly. Return for a moment to that Sterling above the North Sea, the gunner posting out bundle after bundle of what looks like party debris into the dark. He has no idea, most likely, of the year of argument and hesitation that preceded this moment. No idea that men in Whitehall had wrestled for months over the decision to let him do exactly this. He only knows that his job tonight involves throwing paper out of an aeroplane, and that somehow this is meant to keep him alive. And it did. Bomber crews who flew through the window-protected raids of that summer stood a measurably better chance of coming home than those who had flown the identical route only months earlier, protected not by armor, not by better guns, not by faster engines, but by a scrap of foil cut to a very particular length. There is a peculiar kind of genius in solving an impossibly sophisticated problem with an almost embarrassingly simple answer. And there is an equally peculiar kind of courage in sitting on that answer, watching men die because using it too early might have made things worse rather than better. Window was not glamorous. It was not a bomb or a code-breaking machine or a secret aircraft. It was foil and paper and nerve. It cost almost nothing to make and everything to decide to use. Consider the strange asymmetry at the heart of this story. Britain spent years and vast sums developing radar itself, one of the most celebrated scientific achievements of the war. A system of towering aerials and darkened control rooms that gave the RAF its edge during the Battle of Britain. And then, almost as an afterthought, a handful of scientists discovered that the whole edifice, on either side of the channel, could be humbled by strips of foil cut to the right length and thrown out of a window by hand. The most advanced electronic detection system of its age, defeated not by a cleverer machine, but by the absence of one. It is a reminder that in war, as in most things, the most sophisticated tool is not always beaten by a more sophisticated tool. Sometimes it is beaten by something almost childishly simple, deployed with precise understanding of exactly where the sophistication breaks down. And on the night it finally fell from British bomber bays over Hamburg, that scrap of foil did more to keep young men alive than nearly anything else developed in 6 years of war. Thousands of aircrew who might otherwise have been lost to a radar-guided fighter or a precisely aimed anti-aircraft battery instead came home, landed, climbed out of their aircraft, and went to breakfast, never knowing quite how close some of those trips had come to catastrophe, or how differently the numbers might have read had that year of hesitation in Whitehall gone on any longer. Sometimes the weapon that saves the most lives is not the one built to destroy. Sometimes it is the one built simply to confuse, dropped quietly into the dark and trusted to work,